I didn't believe in Bigfoot, not really. I'd heard the stories growing up, grainy footage, huge footprints in mud, blurry shapes moving between trees, but they always felt like campfire legends, something people told each other when the woods got too quiet. But that changed the night I was deep in the forest near Mount St. Helens. I had gone there alone, just a weekend hike, a few miles off the road, far enough to escape the noise of the world. The forest there is different from most places. The trees are massive, old growth, towering firs and cedars that block out most of the sky. Even during the day, the woods feel dim, and at night the darkness feels thick, almost physical. I set up my tent near a small clearing, not far from a narrow creek cutting through the forest floor. The air smelled like damp pine and cold earth. The only sounds were the creek moving slowly over stones and the distant rustling of wind through the branches. It felt peaceful, isolated. Exactly what I came for. At least that's what I thought. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, not from a dream, not from a noise I could clearly identify, just a feeling. The same kind of instinct that wakes animals when something enters their territory. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, no distant owls, just silence. And then I heard it. A single heavy footstep, not close, somewhere deep in the trees. Thump. It sounded like something large stepping onto soft soil. At first I thought it might be a deer, maybe an elk moving through the forest, but then it happened again. Thump. Slower this time, heavier. The ground beneath my tent seemed to vibrate slightly. My heart started beating faster because I knew the sound animals make when they walk through the woods. They rustle leaves, snap twigs, shift brush. This sound was different, measured, deliberate, like something very large, trying to move quietly. Another step, closer now. Thump. I held my breath. The creek kept flowing softly beside the clearing. But beyond that, the forest remained unnaturally still, like every living thing in the woods had suddenly decided to stop moving. Then something happened that made the back of my neck prickle. A knock echoed through the trees, not a branch breaking, not wood cracking naturally. A knock, solid, hollow, like someone had taken a heavy stick and struck the trunk of a tree. Talk. The sound carried through the forest. Then, a few seconds later, another knock answered it from deeper in the woods. Talk. My stomach tightened, because suddenly the stories I'd heard growing up didn't feel so ridiculous anymore. I slowly sat up inside the tent. The thin nylon walls glowed faintly in the moonlight, and outside the clearing, something moved between the trees. A shape too big to be a man, and far too quiet to be anything else. Something was walking through the forest, watching my camp, and whatever it was standing at least 8 feet tall. I didn't move, not at first. I just sat there inside the tent, barely breathing, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen moving between the trees was nothing. A trick of moonlight, a shadow shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. The forest was still, too still. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. Outside the tent, the moon hung low enough to cast pale light across the clearing. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see the shapes of trees standing like dark pillars around my camp. Everything looked normal, except for the feeling in my chest. That instinctive, animal part of my brain that kept whispering one thing: you are not alone. Another sound came from the woods. Thump. This time closer. It wasn't a twig snapping or brush rustling. It was weight, heavy weight pressing down into soil. I slowly reached for my flashlight beside the sleeping bag, gripping it without turning it on. The last thing I wanted to do was shine a beam into the trees and announce exactly where I was. Another knock echoed through the forest. Talk. It came from the same direction as before, somewhere beyond the tree line to the north of the clearing. A few seconds passed, then a second knock answered from farther away. Talk. My stomach tightened. That wasn't random. That was communication. The thought hit me so suddenly it almost made me laugh from nerves. Animals don't knock on trees. But the forest around Mount St. Helens was full of stories like that. Hunters talked about it sometimes, backwoods hikers too. Strange knocks echoing between trees, long howls at night, huge footprints appearing in soft mud along remote trails. Most people laughed it off, but sitting there in the dark, hearing those sounds echo through the miles of forest, I didn't feel like a joke anymore. I crawled slowly toward the zipper of the tent and opened it just enough to peer outside. The cold air hit my face immediately. The clearing looked exactly the same as it had before. My small fire pit, the camping chair, my backpack leaning against a fallen log, the creek glinting faintly in the moonlight, and beyond the clearing, the forest, rows of towering trees disappearing into darkness. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then something shifted. Deep in the woods, a shape passed behind one of the trunks, too tall, too wide. My brain tried to process it. A bear? But bears don't move like that. A shape passed behind one of the trunks, too tall, too wide. My brain tried to process it. A bear? But bears don't move like that. This thing had crossed the space between two trees in two slow strides, and the top of its shape had been level with the lowest branches, nearly 10 feet off the ground. My pulse started hammering in my ears. I watched the forest carefully, waiting, listening. Then the sound came again, but this time it wasn't a knock. It was breathing, deep, slow, somewhere just beyond the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it there. Something enormous standing just inside the tree line, watching my camp, watching me. Another step landed in the dirt. Thump. The ground vibrated slightly under my boots. I froze, because whatever was out there had just stepped into the clearing, and it wasn't trying to hide anymore. For a second, I thought about turning on the flashlight. Just one click, a beam of light across the clearing, and whatever had stepped out of the trees would be revealed. But something deep in my gut told me not to do it, because the moment the light hit it, it would know exactly where I was. So I stayed crouched at the tent's entrance, barely moving, staring into the moonlit clearing. The creek murmured quietly beside me. The trees stood perfectly still, and somewhere just beyond the fire pit, something breathed. Slow, deep, like air moving through a huge chest. I couldn't see the creature clearly at first. The moonlight was weak, broken by branches and drifting clouds, but then it moved. A massive shape shifted slightly to the left, and my brain immediately tried to reject what I was seeing, because the silhouette was wrong, too tall, too broad. The thing standing in the clearing looked like a man, if a man were nearly 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were massive, wide enough that they nearly blended into the darkness of the trees behind it. Its arms hung low at its sides, far lower than a human's arms should reach, almost to the knees. For a moment it just stood there, completely still, and then it lifted its head. The moon slipped free from the clouds for a second, just long enough to catch the outline of its face, not clearly, just the shape. A heavy brow, a broad nose, a head covered in thick, dark hair. My stomach dropped. because every story I'd ever heard suddenly slammed into the front of my mind. Bigfoot, standing in the clearing 10 yards from my tent, watching me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then the creature tilted its head slightly. The motion was slow, curious, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was. My pulse pounded so loudly I was sure I could hear it. And maybe it could, because the next thing it did sent a jolt of fear straight through my spine. It took a step closer. Thump. The ground trembled again. Now the creature was close enough that the moonlight revealed more of its body. Thick, dark fur covering its chest and shoulders, massive thighs like tree trunks, hands the size of dinner plates hanging at the end of those long arms. But the worst part was its eyes. They caught the moonlight just for a second, two faint reflections staring directly at the tent, at me. Not animal eyes, not the vacant stare of a creature wandering the forest. There was intelligence there, awareness, the kind that told me this thing knew exactly what it was doing. And then it did something I'll never forget. It looked around the clearing slowly, left, right, toward the trees, toward the creek, like it was checking the area, making sure of something. Then it turned its head back toward the tent, toward me, and made a sound. Not a roar, not a growl, a low, deep rumble in its chest, almost like a warning. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up instantly, because at that exact moment, a second tree knock echoed from the woods behind my camp. Talk. And the creature in the clearing turned its head sharply toward the forest, like it had just heard someone calling it. The moment the knock echoed through the forest, the creature's entire posture changed. Until then, it had looked curious, cautious, almost calm, but now it stiffened. Its head snapped toward the trees behind my camp, and for the first time I saw just how massive its shoulders were as the muscles tightened under the thick fur. For a few seconds it didn't move, it just listened. The forest remained silent. Then the second knock came again. Talk. This one sounded farther away, deeper in the woods, like someone standing miles out between the trees had struck another trunk. The creature in the clearing lifted its head slightly and released a sound I can only describe as a deep, vibrating grunt. Not loud, but powerful. The kind of sound you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. It echoed faintly through the clearing, and a moment later, something answered. From somewhere far off in the forest, another grunt, lower, longer. My stomach twisted because suddenly the situation felt much worse than it had seconds before. There wasn't just one of them. The huge figure near my camp turned slightly, giving me a better view of its side profile in the moonlight. Its chest rose and fell slowly with steady breaths. Its head moved as it listened carefully to the words, and then it took another step. Thump. But this time it didn't move toward the tent. It moved sideways across the clearing, positioning itself between me and the direction where the answering sound had come from. For a moment I hadn't understood why. Then the thought hit me like a cold splash of water. It wasn't blocking me, it was blocking something else from reaching the clearing. Another distant knock echoed through the forest. Talk. Then another. Talk. The pattern continued, spaced several seconds apart like signals moving through the woods. My pulse pounded harder because now I realized something terrifying. Those knocks weren't random, they were moving closer, and the giant creature standing in my clearing clearly knew it. It turned its head slowly back toward the tent, toward me. For a few seconds we just stared at each other again, but the look in its eyes had changed. The curiosity was gone. Now there was urgency there. It took 2 slow steps toward my camp, close enough that I could hear the soft crunch of dirt under its feet. My grip tightened on the flashlight. Part of me wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except sit there frozen in the open tent. But the creature didn't act like it was about to attack. Instead, it lowered its head slightly and made another deep rumbling sound. Short, sharp, almost like a command. Then it lifted one massive arm and pointed directly toward the trees on the far side of the clearing, the opposite direction from the approaching knocks. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. A giant creature standing 10 yards away, pointing into the forest as if it wanted me to go that way. Another knock echoed closer now. Talk. The creature turned its head sharply toward the sound again. The rumbling in its chest grew louder, more aggressive, and suddenly the entire forest answered. Branches snapped somewhere deep in the trees, heavy footsteps moving quickly through the underbrush, more than one set, coming straight toward the clearing. The giant figure near my camp looked back at me one last time, and for a split second, it didn't look like a monster at all. It looked like something trying to warn me. Because whatever was coming through the forest, it wasn't just one creature. It was several. The forest exploded with movement. Branches snapped somewhere beyond the tree line. Heavy footsteps tore through the underbrush, fast, powerful, and closing the distance between the woods and the clearing. More than one. At least 2, maybe 3. My pulse surged so hard it felt like my chest might burst. The massive figure standing near my camp, the one I had just watched emerge from the trees, turned its head toward the approaching sounds again. Its entire body tensed. The thick fur along its shoulders seemed to rise slightly as the muscles beneath it tightened. Then it made a sound. Loud this time. A deep, thunderous bark that rolled through the clearing like distant thunder. It wasn't directed at me. It was aimed straight at the forest, at whatever was coming. For a few seconds, the words went silent again. Then another knock came back. Talk. But this one was closer, much closer. I could almost pinpoint the tree it came from, maybe 50 yards away. The giant creature near my camp responded instantly. It stepped forward and struck its own tree with something in its hand. A thick fallen branch I hadn't even noticed it pick up. Crack. The sound was explosive in the quiet forest. The branch slammed against the trunk so hard that bark flew into the air. Then it did it again. Crack. Crack. The sound echoed like gunshots through the woods. My ears rang from the noise, and the response from the forest came immediately. Movement stopped. The approaching footsteps froze. For several seconds, nothing happened. The giant creature stood perfectly still, again, listening, waiting. The silence stretched so long I started to wonder if whatever had been approaching had turned back. Then something massive moved between the trees at the far edge of the clearing. Not the one standing near my camp, another shape. This one slightly smaller, but still far larger than any human. It stepped forward just enough that the moonlight caught its outline. Broad shoulders, long arms, a head covered in dark hair. Another Bigfoot. My stomach dropped because now I could see at least 2 of them, the one near my camp and the one standing just inside the tree line. The 2 creatures stared at each other across the clearing, completely silent. Then the second one made a low rumbling sound, almost like a question. The giant beside my camp answered immediately, a deeper rumble, shorter, more aggressive. The second creature shifted its weight slightly, glancing toward the direction where the other footsteps had come from. Then it looked back at the one near me. Seconds passed. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to feel. Finally, the second creature turned away. Its massive shape slipped back between the trees and disappeared into the forest. The footsteps farther out in the woods began to retreat as well. branches snapping, leaves rustling, moving away from the clearing. Slowly the forest returned to silence. The giant figure near my camp remained where it stood, watching the trees carefully, making sure the others were really gone. Then it turned its head back toward my tent, toward me, and for the first time since I'd woken up, it relaxed, just slightly, like whatever had been approaching had been the real danger, and somehow it had just chased them away. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The clearing was silent again. The footsteps that had been crashing through the woods were gone now, fading deeper into the forest until even the snapping of branches disappeared. All that remained was the quiet sound of the creek beside my camp, and the massive creature standing only a few yards away. My brain was still struggling to catch up with everything that had just happened. There had been more than one, at least two, maybe more, and somehow the one standing in front of me had just driven them away. The giant figure slowly turned its head back toward the tree line one more time, scanning the dark forest carefully, making sure the others were really gone. Then it looked back at the tent, back at me. The moonlight caught its eyes again for a brief second. They weren't glowing, they weren't animal-like. They looked aware, focused, like it was thinking, like it was deciding something. My grip tightened around the flashlight again. Part of me wanted to switch it on to just confirm what my eyes were seeing. But another part of me, something deeper, instinctive, told me not to do anything that might startle the creature. Because standing that close to something that large, I knew there would be no outrunning it. The creature took a slow step toward the creek. Thump, then another thump. Not toward the tent, just moving along the edge of the clearing. Its movements were unbelievingly quiet for something so big. The long arms swung slightly with each step. The shoulders rolled with heavy, controlled power. When it reached the edge of the water, it stopped. The creek was narrow there, only a few feet across. Moonlight reflected faintly off the slow-moving current. The creature looked down at the water, then slowly crouched. Watching it move up close made my breath catch. Even crouched, it was still enormous. It dipped one hand into the creek and lifted it again. Water dripped slowly from its fingers. For a second, it simply watched the droplets fall. Then it turned its head back toward the tent, toward me. The moment stretched long enough that I realized something strange. It wasn't just aware of me, it was studying me, the same way a person might watch an unfamiliar animal in the woods, curious, cautious, trying to understand. Then the creature did something that sent a chill through my spine. I stood back up, slowly, and walked straight toward the tent. One step, another. Now it was less than 10 feet away, close enough that I could see the details in the moonlight. The thick, dark hair covering its chest, the massive hands, the powerful muscles moving beneath the fur. But the thing that held my attention the most was its face, the heavy brow, the broad nose, the deep-set eyes watching me carefully. It stopped right outside the tent. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other through the thin nylon wall. Then the creature lifted one massive hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed it against the outside of the tent. The fabric stretched inward under the weight of its palm. The shape of its hand was enormous, nearly the size of my entire head. And in that moment, something about the situation shifted in my mind. Because the creature wasn't acting aggressive, it wasn't trying to tear the tent open. It wasn't threatening me, it was checking, almost like it was confirming I was still there. Then it pulled its hand away and turned its head sharply toward the forest again, because somewhere out in the darkness, another knock echoed through the trees. Talk. But this one was much farther away, and whatever had made it was no longer coming toward the clearing. The knock echoed through the forest and then faded. Dark, far away now, distant enough that the sound seemed to dissolve into the miles of trees surrounding the mountain. The giant figure outside my tent didn't move at first. It just stood there, its massive shape blocking part of the moonlight, listening, waiting, its head tilted slightly, the same way it had earlier in the clearing, like it was mirroring the distance, making sure the other creatures were truly gone. Minutes passed, nothing else answered the knock. No footsteps, no branches snapping, no movement in the woods. Just the quiet rush of the creek and the distant whisper of wind high in the trees. Slowly, the giant creature relaxed again. The tension in its shoulders eased. It took a single step backward from the tent, then another, giving the clearing space again. For the first time since I'd woken up, I managed to take a full breath. My lungs felt tight from holding it in for so long. The creature turned slightly, walking toward the fallen log where my backpack rested. It leaned forward just enough that the moonlight revealed the full size of its back. The width of its shoulders was unbelievable, easily twice as broad as mine. Its fur was thick and dark, almost black in the dim light, with streaks of brown where the moon caught it. And then something strange happened. The creature crouched again, not by the creek this time, by the ground near my campfire pit. It reached down slowly and touched the dirt, running its fingers lightly through the ash from the fire I had built earlier that evening. It lifted its hand again and brought the fingers close to its face, smelling them, studying them. The gesture looked almost human, curious, thoughtful. For a moment it stayed there like that, examining the strange objects scattered around my camp, the chair, the fire pit, the tent. Then it stood again and turned toward the tree line. For a second I thought it might leave, but before stepping into the forest, it stopped. Its head turned slowly back toward the tent, toward me. We locked eyes again through the faint moonlight, and this time the moment felt different, longer, more deliberate, as if the creature was memorizing something, memorizing me. Then it did something unexpected. It lifted its head slightly and released a low, deep call into the forest, not loud like before. This one was longer. Then it did something unexpected. It lifted its head slightly and released a low, deep call into the forest, not loud like before. This one was longer. A deep, echoing howl that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. The sound vibrated through the trees and faded slowly into the distance. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it, and when the echo finally died away, the forest answered, but not nearby, far off, miles away. Another call rose through the mountains, lower, fainter, responding. My skin prickled as the realization settled in. That call wasn't random, it was a message, a signal. The giant creature listened for a few seconds longer. Then it lowered its head, satisfied, and stepped silently into the forest. Within 2 strides, its massive body vanished between the trees. The clearing was empty again. The moonlight returned to the ground where it had been standing, and the woods around my camp slowly came back to life. Insects chirped again, the wind moved through the branches, the normal sounds of the forest returned, but I didn't relax. Because as I sat there staring at the dark tree line, one thought kept repeating in my head. The creature hadn't just passed through my camp. It had stayed, it had watched, and somehow it had been protecting something. For a long time after the creature disappeared into the trees, I didn't move. I stayed crouched at the entrance of the tent, staring at the empty clearing. The moonlight fell across the dirt where it had just stood moments before. Everything looked normal again. The fire pit, the chair, the creek flowing slowly beside the clearing, but nothing felt normal anymore because I knew exactly how big that thing had been. and I knew how quietly it had moved through the forest. Slowly, I crawled out of the tent. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped onto the dirt of the clearing. For a few seconds, I just listened. The woods sounded alive again, insects chirping, branches shifting in the wind. Somewhere far away, an owl called once before going silent again. No footsteps, no knocks, no deep rumbling calls. The giant creature was gone. At least I thought it was. I walked carefully toward the center of the clearing where it had been standing earlier. My boots crunched softly against gravel near the fire pit, and then I saw them, footprints, huge ones, pressed deep in the soil. My stomach tightened immediately. I crouched down beside the first one. Even in the faint moonlight, it was obvious what I was looking at. A footprint nearly 16 inches long, maybe wider than my entire hand. 5 clear toe impressions, a deep heel mark. The soil around it had been compressed so hard that the edges of the print had cracked outward. Whatever had made it weighed a lot, much more than any human. Slowly I stood and looked around the clearing. There were more prints, a trail leading from the trees across the open ground toward my tent, and then another set heading toward the creek, exactly where I had watched the creature crouch near the water. I followed those prints slowly, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I reached the edge of the creek, I found something else. Handprints, massive ones, pressed into the soft mud beside the water. 5 thick finger marks spread across the surface, the same size as the hand I had seen pressed against my tent. My breath caught as I looked back toward the tree line. The forest stood silent again, dark and endless, and suddenly I remembered something from earlier in the night. The way the creature had looked around the clearing, checking the woods, watching the trees, like it was guarding something. My eyes moved slowly across the forest, trying to imagine where the other creatures had been when they approached the clearing, where they had stopped, where they had turned back. Then I noticed something strange at the far edge of the clearing. Near the direction where the second creature had appeared, the trees there were disturbed, branches bent, underbrush pushed aside, like something large had been standing there for a while, watching, not entering the clearing, just observing from the shadows. I took a few steps toward that spot. The ground there looked different. The soil was torn slightly, not from footprints, from something dragging. My stomach twisted as the realization slowly formed. Whatever had been standing there had been pacing back and forth, waiting for the giant creature near my camp to leave. I stood there in the moonlight, staring at the disturbed ground, and a chilling thought crept slowly into my mind. The one that had stood near my tent, the one that had driven the others away, might not have been hunting me. It might have been guarding me, because the others, they had been waiting for their chance. I didn't sleep after that, not even for a minute. I sat beside the dying embers of my campfire, staring at the tree line while the night slowly crawled toward morning. Every so often I would hear something move deep in the forest, a branch shifting, leaves rustling, but nothing ever stepped back into the clearing. Still, the feeling never left, the feeling that eyes were on me from somewhere out there in the dark, watching, waiting. Every few minutes I would glance toward the direction where the giant creature had disappeared, half expecting it to step back out of the trees again, but it never did. The forest stayed quiet. Hours passed like that, slow, heavy. Eventually, the eastern sky began to lighten. A faint gray glow appeared between the trees. Dawn. The first bird started calling somewhere high in the branches. The darkness slowly loosened its grip on the forest, and for the first time since midnight, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. Morning changes everything in the woods. The shapes become clearer, The sounds become familiar again. The unknown shrinks back into the ordinary trees and shadows. I packed my gear quickly, faster than I normally would have. Every movement felt urgent now, like some instinct was telling me it was time to leave. The last thing I did before taking down the tent was look at the spot where the creature had pressed its hand against the fabric. The nylon was stretched slightly there, not torn, just pushed inward from the pressure. The shape of the hand had been so big that even now I could still see the faint outline where the material had creased. I swallowed hard and turned toward the trail. The hike back to the road was supposed to take 2 hours. Normally, I would have enjoyed the walk, the cool morning air, the quiet forest. But that morning felt different. Every step along the trail felt like I was walking through a place that wasn't entirely mine. The forest was waking up now, birds calling, squirrels moving through branches, the normal life of the woods returning, and yet something strange kept happening. Every few minutes I would stop walking because I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy ones, not loud, just distant, like something large moving carefully between the trees, following. The first time it happened, I turned around immediately. The trail behind me was empty, just a narrow path cutting through miles of forest. No movement, no shapes, nothing. I told myself it was just nerves, the aftershock of everything that had happened during the night. But the sound came again, 20 minutes later. Thump, soft, far away, then silence. I turned again, still nothing, but this time I noticed something new. Off to the side of the trail, a footprint, huge, pressed into a patch of soft soil beside a fallen log. My stomach tightened instantly. It was fresh enough that the edges of the print hadn't even crumbled yet, and it wasn't on the trail behind me. It was off to the side, parallel to the path I was walking, like something had been moving through the forest beside me, keeping pace. My eyes slowly scanned the trees. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, quiet, empty. But the feeling returned stronger than before, that I wasn't walking out of the woods alone. And suddenly I remembered the way the giant creature had looked at me before disappearing into the forest. That long, deliberate stare, almost like it had made a decision. Because as I continued walking down the trail, the footsteps in the woods returned, soft, heavy, steady, and no matter how fast I walked, they stayed with me all the way to the edge of the forest. The footsteps didn't stop, not when I sped up, not when I slowed down. They stayed somewhere out in the forest beside the trail, always just far enough away that I couldn't see what was making them. Thump, pause, thump, heavy but controlled, like something massive trying not to make noise. My nerves were stretched thin by that point. Every instinct told me not to run. Running in the woods is how people trip, fall, get lost. But the urge was there, the feeling that if I didn't move faster, whatever was pacing me through the trees might eventually decide to step onto the trail. So I kept walking, quick, steady, trying not to look panicked. The morning light was stronger now, spilling through the tall fir ears around Mount St. Helens. The forest didn't look nearly as but that didn't make the footsteps any less real. They were still there, still moving through the trees beside me. About 30 minutes into the hike back, the trail curved along a shallow ridge. From that spot, you could see a long stretch of forest down the slope, miles of trees rolling across the mountainside. Normally, it was one of the best views on the trail. That morning, I barely noticed it because the footsteps stopped completely. The silence that followed felt heavy, like something holding its breath. I stopped walking too, Slowly, I turned my head toward the woods beside the trail. Nothing moved. The trees stood tall and still. No shapes, no motion, just shadows between the trunks. For a few seconds, I wondered if whatever had been following me had finally turned away. Then something shifted far down the slope. At first, I thought it was a shadow moving between the trees, but then the shape stepped forward slightly, and my stomach dropped. A massive dark figure stood between two trees about 50 yards downhill. Even from that distance, I could see how tall it was. Easily 8 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were broad and heavy. Its arms hung low at its sides. The thick dark fur along its body moved slightly in the breeze. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't sneaking. It was just standing there, watching me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then the creature tilted its head slightly, the same curious motion I had seen the night before, and suddenly I knew exactly who it was. The same giant Bigfoot that had stood outside my tent, the same one that had chased the others away from the clearing. It hadn't been stalking me, it hadn't been walking beside me, escorting me through the forest, making sure I reached the edge of its territory safely. The realization sent a strange chill through my chest, because that meant one thing: the others were still out there, somewhere deeper in the woods, waiting. The giant figure continued watching me for another few seconds. Then it slowly turned its body away. With 2 long strides, it moved behind a line of trees, and just like that, it disappeared again into the forest. The footsteps never returned after that, and 20 minutes later, I reached the road. I leaned against my car, trying to catch my breath. The morning air was crisp, sharp in my lungs, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to relax just slightly. The forest loomed behind me, silent now, empty, or at least it seemed that way. I glanced back at the trail I had just walked. The footprints, the handprints, the disturbance in the underbrush, they were all gone. Or maybe the forest had simply reclaimed them, covering every sign with leaves and dirt in the quiet hours of early morning. I couldn't be sure. All I knew was what I had experienced, and it didn't feel like a dream. Not the way the creature had moved, not the sounds in the night, not the presence so enormous it passed against the very edges of the clearing. I thought about the knock echoes, the heavy footsteps in the shadows, the low rumbles that vibrated through my chest. Every detail stayed in my mind, every one of them burned like a brand. For a moment I thought about telling someone, a friend, a ranger, a local, but how could I explain it? How could I describe a creature so massive, so intelligent, and so deliberate that it had almost seemed human in its motions? I shook my head. No one would believe me. The forest had swallowed my fear, my footsteps, my story. All that remained was the memory, a memory of being watched, of being followed, of being escorted safely out of the darkness by something that could have crushed me in a single movement, but didn't. I stared at the road stretching down the mountain. Cars would pass in a few minutes, people unaware of the forest behind them, of the stories hidden in its shadows, of the giant that lived there. I pressed my hand against the hood of the car, still feeling my pulse racing. Even now, hours later, my body refused to forget, and a single thought lingered, echoing in my mind like the fading knocks through the trees. The forest isn't empty. Not really. Not ever. Not when the Bigfoot walks there. I drove down the mountain slowly, my eyes constantly flicking to the edge of the forest. The trees seemed ordinary in the daylight, but I knew better now. I knew what had been moving through them last night. The giant creature, Bigfoot, was still out there, watching, waiting. I tried to make sense of it. Why had it come near me? Why had it chased the others away? Was it protecting something or someone? The thought made my stomach knot tighter than ever. I reached the first small town at the base of the mountain. The roads were empty, the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke from distant chimneys. I told myself the encounter was over, that I was safe, but deep down I knew that wasn't true, because the forest had a memory, and creatures like that, they never forget. Even now, months later, I can feel it. Every time I walk near the woods, every time I hear distant knocks on the crunch of leaves underfoot, I know it's there, watching, waiting. And part of me wonders, if I ever return to those woods, will it let me leave again? Or will I finally see what hides in the shadows, moving silently between the trees, thinking, judging, deciding my fate? Some nights when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear it. A low, rumbling breath carried through the trees, and I know the forest remembers me, because Bigfoot never forgets. And maybe it's still out there, watching, always.